Hey, what is up guys? My name is Oleg, this is Bond. Say hi to the people in the camera. Welcome back to the channel. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. Please subscribe if you like the content. Last week I did a video about my top 5 reasons why you should get into vintage watch collecting. Now, if you thought vintage watch collecting was great, it was all sunshine and rainbows, well, you're wrong. Vintage watch collecting sucks. It's the worst thing you can do, and here are the 5 reasons why. Reason number 1. Vintage watches are hard to service and to repair. Now let's start with servicing vintage watches. If you have any in your collection, you know that sometimes it's smooth and easy because their mechanisms are fairly simple and straightforward. But obviously, the more complicated the movement is, the more rare the watch is, the harder it is to service. And some watchmakers will not even attempt servicing them. So that adds additional costs to the servicing of your watch. Maybe you have to mail it to a watchmaker in a different city. Maybe you have to source some special parts for the servicing. All of that costs extra money and it's extra hassle as opposed to servicing a new watch. Now, repairing a vintage watch is a totally different story. Here, it could be extremely difficult to source specific parts. Now, of course, the more rare the watch is, the harder it would be to find these parts. And a lot of times you will find that the specific part that you're looking for, let's say a crystal, could cost nearly as much as what you paid for this watch, just because it's so hard to find the right part in the right condition. Reason number 2. Vintage watches tend to be on a smaller size. Most vintage watches are under 36 millimeters. Now, I know that there are large vintage watches, some pilot watches, but we're not talking about those. What we're talking about here is kind of majority of what you can expect when you buy a vintage watch. And most of them are on a smaller size. If you have a small wrist or mid-size wrist, that could be okay with you and you don't really care. However, if you have a large wrist or if you prefer larger, kind of more modern looking watches, that is a problem because most of them are under 36 millimeters in diameter, and on your large wrist it would look tiny. Reason number 3. Vintage watches are not very accurate. Now again, I know that there are still very accurate vintage watches and there are exceptions to every rule, but for the most part vintage watches are off by a minute or two every day. Now if you have many watches in your collection and it's just one of them, that's not a big problem because you wear it once, you put it in your watch box and you wear your next watch the next day. However, if it's your only watch, then it becomes a problem because you have to adjust it pretty much every day or every couple of days because you will either be losing or gaining a couple of minutes a day, and that becomes a bit of an annoying negative. Reason number 4, you're never sure what you're buying and it's very easy to buy a bad watch. Now, what do I mean when I say you're not sure what you're buying? Let me give you an example. The Tissot that I bought this week, when I bought it at the flea market and I was not able to open the case back. It's not like I could whip out my knife and, pop the case back open. So I had to wait until I got home to see if it's actually a Tissot movement and if it's an original movement, if it's not a Franken watch. So all these things are hard to know when you're buying a vintage watch. Now, if you're buying on eBay online, you can sometimes ask sellers some questions. You can ask when the watch was serviced last, and maybe I'll do a video about buying vintage watches, some principles to follow when you're buying one of the vintage watches. Leave your comments in the comment section below if you'd like to see that video. But coming back to this, so I couldn't look at the movement, and majority of the time you can't really look at the movement when you're purchasing the watch. Or maybe you can look at the movement but you're not sure if it's all original parts, if the crown is original, if the hands are original, unless you're absolute expert at this specific watch. So it's easy to buy a bad watch, and it's also easy to buy a watch that on the day that you buy it works, but the next day it stops working. And it's not like you can go back and return it, or it's not like you have a warranty card for 12 months where you can, just send back the watch and they repair it for you or replace it. So here you're stuck with a quote-unquote bad watch. It becomes a bit of a negative, and especially once you get into kind of higher end watches, once you start buying vintage Rolexes or vintage Omegas. Although vintage Omegas are not that expensive, but let's say vintage JLC. Now these watches are faked a lot. A lot of them are Franken watches, which basically means watches that are made from parts that are sourced from a whole bunch of different movements, different watches. Some are even pocket watches that are put into this one case and are sold as a genuine vintage timepiece. And of course, as a vintage watch collector, that's the last thing that you want. Reason number 5: vintage watches could be hard to sell. Now this reason is kind of a negative for vintage watches, but it's not specific to vintage watches. This kind of applies to all watches that you just purchase. Now what do I mean by it's hard to resell? Sometimes you buy a vintage watch and it's easy to resell. You put it on eBay, you put it on Craigslist, and somebody else comes along and buys it from you. But sometimes some vintage timepieces are very hard to sell, just because the general public is not that interested in watches in the first place, and especially they're not really interested in vintage watches. If they're buying something, they're going to buy brand new from a department store. So what you're stuck with when you're selling a vintage watch, you're stuck with other vintage watch collectors, kind of watch enthusiasts who will buy it from you. Now, if you have a watch that is not specifically rare or special in any way, it could be difficult to sell, and in some cases could be pretty much impossible to sell because nobody else will want this specific timepiece. And those were my top 5 negatives why you should never ever even think about buying vintage watches. But again, vintage watches are great, they're a lot of fun. Watch my part 1 of this video and I hope I will convince you back to the light side of how great and fun vintage watches could be. Just be aware that there are negatives, as I mentioned in this video. I appreciate you watching until the end. If you like the content, click the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. It would make Bond and I very happy. And leave your thoughts in the comment section below. We always enjoy reading them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.